Hi, everybody. I'm Sophia, and today we're going to be talking about the federalism disadvantage. We're going to take a deeper look into it. So, just a general story. You can also watch a YouTube video where Sukriti dives into the evidence a little bit more. But let's just start with a general overview. So, with the affirmative, remember, we're wanting to decrease mass incarceration. And they're going to do this by changing federal funding to try and give states sort of like a financial incentive to decrease their prison population. And their advantage to that is that incarceration equals poverty, and poverty is that bad cycle of social inequality, and the affirmative wants to change that. But today we're really going to focus on negative. And so as debating for the negative side, we always want to maintain the status quo. But not only do we want to do that, we also want to argue that something that the affirmative is advocating for actually causes something bad. And that bad thing we're going to call federalism. And we're going to talk about the federalism disadvantage. And kind of just big picture of it is that doing the plan hurts federalism in some way. So what is federalism? We hear that term a lot. It's a great term to kind of get to know. The federalism disadvantage pops up every so and then as the debate topics change. So federalism is a system of government in the US, and it divides the local, state, and federal or the national powers. A lot of times you'll hear words like separation of powers, checks and balances kind of relate to federalism, and those are great kind of key terms you can remember to use when you debate. So let's break down each part of the disadvantage. And so the first part of the disadvantage is uniqueness. And uniqueness is what's happening now. And in fancy debate terms, we like to call that the status quo. So if you look specifically at the lesser 18 evidence, it talks about how right now states are leading criminal justice reform, and they're doing a good job of doing that. And the plan hurts federalism, and that kind of undermines state powers. So keep in mind, federalism is that level of the federal government, the state government, and the local government. So this will doing the plan will sort of crowd out a lot of the efforts that the state and local government are doing already. Because ultimately, even though the federal government might set a regulation, it's the state and local government that are really implementing these changes to their prison populations. All right, so the next part of the disadvantage is the link. And the link is what it sounds like. It's how we're going to connect our disadvantage and link it to the plan. So it's how the plan negatively changes something in the status quo. Remember that we're arguing for the status quo. And so in the sum and 19 evidence, the federal grant that the affirmative is talking about threatens federalism, and it's specific to those federal grants, and that those hurt federalism, and that's bad, and that's what we want to argue for the next side. The reason that is because those federal grants that the government is giving a lot of times have conditions on them. And so the federal government telling state and local authorities, hey, we'll give you some money if you do this for us, probably isn't the best idea. That gives the federal government a lot of control, and it kind of gives them some financial leverage that the neg argues isn't the best thing to do, because it easily coerces states to do what the federal government wants them to do. And so even though the states would technically be implementing those changes, it's the federal government that really has that control due to the federal grants. So the internal link is also super important. And this is how we get from the link that we just talked about to the final impact, which is always the most exciting part of the disad. So specifically, if you look at your Graham evidence, it talks about how federalism is key to solve global warming. And so if you kind of look at that sentence, that gives you a hint that our impact is going to be about global warming. And so because we need federalism to solve global warming, this internal link card specifically talks about how the states have the power to set environmental regulations now, because President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accord, and that those states do a pretty good job. But if we don't do that, that could cause some negative consequences. So that brings us to everyone's favorite part of the disad, which is the impact. And the impact is the negative consequence of doing the plan. So it's the final bad thing that's going to happen. And we like to focus on this a lot because it's really convincing to your judge. So the card that you want to look at that specifically is Torres 2016. And our impact is that global warming causes extinction. And extinction is not good. Torres specifically talks about how these are severe and irreversible effects. It's catastrophic. And then it also talks about how extinction from global warming can lead to a lot of other bad problems. These problems talk about increased likelihood of nuclear war and overall loss of human life. It can hurt the global ecosystem, cause a lot of social and civil unrest. So there's a lot that's in this impact evidence card that you can use to make it more convincing. So we've kind of talked about just a general overview of the Disad, but after you read the disadvantage, the shell in your win and see, well, how do you use that to keep winning? And so we use that by using something that we like to call Mr. T. And if you want to be extra fancy, you can say impact calculus, and I think your judge will be really impressed. But just a brief overview of Mr. T. Remember that M stands for magnitude. So that's how big is your impact? How many people will that affect? And then the R is risk. So what's the probability and the likelihood of your impact happening? And then time frame is how soon do you think your impact is going to happen? So specifically for this Disad, we can always look at the Taurus 16 card because that really focuses on the impact of the disadvantage and what's so bad about doing the plan. So as neg, you always want to say your impact is huge. So, and that's what it sounds like. Extinction would be a horrible problem. It would be a complete loss of human life, and that would be really bad. So it makes sense to argue that our magnitude would be really big, especially when comparing it to the affirmative, that their advantage is poverty, and it talks about how they should do the plan because poverty affects a lot of people and it traps them in this bad cycle of social inequality. As neg, we can argue that we need to prioritize human life over human rights. Even though poverty is really important, we can't have a concern about poverty if the people aren't even alive due to extinction from global warming. So the next part of Mr. T is risk. And you always want to say your risk is highly likely, and you can talk about this because it's specifically backed up by science about the risk of global warming and how it can cause extinction. And we need federalism to prevent this collapse from happening and all the negative effects of global warming. And then last is our time frame, which is important when talking about global warming. So as a negative, you always want to say that your impact will happen as soon as you do the plan. So even if you personally don't always agree with the magnitude, risk, or time frame that you're arguing, it's always important to make sure to go to extremes, and that's a fun debate. So time frame, as soon as we do the plan, our impact of global warming is going to happen. The Taurus evidence specifically talks about a wave of independent state actions. I think it's like 34 states, and they'll all contribute greenhouse gases, which would be bad, and that would trigger our impact, and that would cause extinction from global warming to happen sooner, and that's not good. So we should prioritize our impact. So some of the big takeaways from just kind of breaking down the disadvantage and going through Mr. T is that Mr. T is always so impressive to your judges, and to be explicit about it. Say, judge, I'm going to be doing impact calculus. Here's our magnitude, here's our risk, here's our time frame. Always explain and refer to your evidence. Mr. T is a great way to kind of break down the impacts and help your judge decide who they should vote to win. And so always try and do Mr. T, especially in rebuttal. Make sure you're telling a story and just explaining your knowledge about the evidence. And good